It is the spring of the year 46 before the Common Era, in a coastal town in North Africa called Utica. The Republic of Rome has just lost its last battle. The winner, Julius Caesar, is marching this way, and everyone knows he intends to be merciful, to forgive his enemies and let them live and rule them all. In a quiet room, a man in his late 40s has spent the evening calmly discussing philosophy with his friends. He has read, that night, a dialogue about the immortality of the soul. And then, when the house is asleep, he picks up his own sword. He would rather end himself by his own hand than accept his life as a gift from a man he believes has murdered the freedom of Rome. He will not, he says, owe his existence to a tyrant. His name is Marcus Porcius Cato. History calls him Cato the Younger to set him apart from his great-grandfather, a famous and severe statesman of an earlier age. He was born in the year 95 before the Common Era into one of Rome's most respected families and orphaned young. And from his earliest childhood, the ancient sources tell us, there was something about him that was simply different. Not warmer, not more brilliant, harder. An old story has it that as a small boy, he was dangled out of a high window by a man trying to frighten the children into supporting a political cause, and that Cato, unlike the others, did not cry, did not plead, and stared the man down in silence until he was put back inside. The story may be a later invention. Many of the Cato stories are. But Romans told that kind of story about him for a reason, and the reason is the subject of this entire episode. Cato became, in adulthood, the most rigidly, austerely, almost inhumanly principled man in the Roman state. He was a stoic, a serious one, a practicing one, and he took the philosophy not as a comfort, but as a set of iron rules to be obeyed without exception, whatever the personal cost. He walked bareheaded in the heat and the cold. He went on foot while other senators rode. He wore plain, dark clothing when fashion demanded bright. He drank little. He gave away money easily and accumulated none. He was, deliberately, a living rebuke, a man who had made his own body into an argument about how a Roman ought to live. And in his public life, Cato was famous for one quality above all others, the quality this episode is built around. He could not be bought. In an age when Roman politics ran almost entirely on bribery, on favors, on the quiet purchase of votes and verdicts and loyalties, Cato was the fixed point that the corruption could not move. When he served as the official in charge of the treasury, he terrified the professional clerks by actually knowing the law, actually checking the accounts, actually recovering stolen public money, and refusing every arrangement. When he gave a verdict as a juror, both sides knew it could not be reached with money. When he cast a vote, no faction owned it. He was, in a deeply cynical city, the one man whose price did not exist, and everyone, friend and enemy alike, knew it. Now, I want to be honest with you from the start, because this channel does not deal in saints. Cato's rigidity was not only a virtue, it was, at times, a genuine flaw, and a serious one. He could be obstinate to the point of harming the very causes he loved. He sometimes refused reasonable compromise so completely that he handed victories to worse men. His unbending nature, some ancient writers argued, helped push Rome toward the very civil war he dreaded, because a state needs flexibility to survive, and Cato had almost none. So do not hear this as the story of a perfect man. Hear it as the story of a specific question asked at maximum intensity. The question is, what is a person's integrity actually worth? And is there a price, any price, at which it is correct to sell it? Cato spent his entire life answering, no, no price, not ever. And then he was asked to prove it. To understand why Cato dies in that room in Utica, you have to understand how a Stoic of his kind saw the act of corruption. And it begins, as it always does on this channel, with the dividing line. Some things are up to us, some things are not. On the side that is not up to us, the body, property, reputation, office, the favor of the powerful, victory, survival itself. On the side that is up to us, a very short list. Our judgments, our intentions, our choices, the integrity of our own will. Everything in the first column is, in the Stoic view, the only thing a person actually owns. Everything in the second column is on loan from fortune. Now, here's the move that makes Cato make sense, and it is a move people miss. A bribe, a threat, a temptation, any act of corruption is always structurally the same transaction. It is an offer to trade. Someone offers you something from the second column: money, safety, advancement, the ending of your fear. And in exchange, they ask you to hand over a piece of the first column, a judgment you know to be false, a vote you know to be wrong, a verdict against your own conscience, a loyalty you do not actually hold. Corruption is exactly and always the sale of first column goods for second column currency. And to a Stoic of Cato's seriousness, that trade is not merely dishonorable, it is insane. It is the act of a man selling the one thing he genuinely owns in order to buy more of the things he was only ever borrowing. And this is why Cato could not be bought. Not because he was straining, white-knuckled against constant temptation, but because for him, the temptation had been dissolved at its root. You cannot tempt a man with a trade he considers a catastrophic loss. Offer Cato money to deliver a corrupt verdict, and you are not offering him a gain at a moral cost. In his own framework, you are offering to take from him the only thing he owns: his integrity, his judgment, the soundness of his own will, and to leave him in exchange with a heavier purse and a self he can no longer respect. That is not a tempting offer. That is a robbery dressed as a gift. The reason corruption had no purchase on Cato was that he had genuinely, all the way down, relocated his sense of his own wealth. His treasure was entirely in the first column, and you cannot bribe a man by offering him things he does not count as treasure in exchange for the only thing he does. Let me make this concrete because it is far closer to your life than a Roman courtroom. You will be offered this trade, not once, constantly, in small denominations, your whole life. The chance to advance by staying quiet about something you know is wrong. The chance to be liked by agreeing with the thing you do not believe. The chance to keep the peace, or keep the job, or keep the friendship by shading a verdict, softening a truth, casting the easy vote instead of the honest one. Every one of those is the Cato transaction, scaled down. Second column currency offered for a piece of your first column self. And the ordinary, sensible, universal advice is, it is a small piece. Take the deal. It barely costs anything. Cato's entire life is a single, unwavering argument against that advice. Not because the piece is large, often it is genuinely small, but because of what the act of selling does to the seller. The first time you trade a piece of your integrity for an outcome, you have established the exchange rate. You have priced yourself. And a self that has a price is a different kind of thing forever after than a self that does not. Cato's refusal was never really about any single vote. It was about refusing ever to let the exchange rate be set. He would not become a man who had a price, because the man who has a price has already sold the most important thing, which is the knowledge that he does not. To understand the room in Utica, you have to understand what Cato spent his whole public life trying to protect, and the man he spent it opposing. Cato served the Roman Republic. Not a perfect thing. It was an oligarchy. It rested on conquest and on slavery, and Cato himself never fundamentally challenged either. But it was a system in which power was divided, checked, term-limited, and answerable. No single man ruled. Offices were shared and rotated. The point of the whole intricate machine was that authority should never gather undivided into one pair of hands. And in Cato's lifetime, that machine was visibly, audibly breaking. And one man, more than any other, embodied the breaking. That man was Gaius Julius Caesar. Brilliant, charming, generous, an extraordinary general, genuinely beloved by his soldiers and by much of the Roman poor, and, in Cato's clear and unwavering judgment, the single most dangerous human being alive. Because Cato saw, earlier and more plainly than almost anyone, what Caesar was actually accumulating. Not just victories, not just wealth and popularity. Caesar was gathering all of it into himself, personally, armies loyal to him rather than to Rome, a fortune that could buy whole sections of the state, a glory so vast that no ordinary office could contain it. Caesar, Cato understood, was on a path that ended in one place only. One man, above the law, ruling alone. The death of the divided power that was the entire point of the Republic. And so Cato became Caesar's most relentless, most uncompromising, lifelong opponent in the Senate. He filibustered, he blocked, he accused, he warned, over and over, in language that the comfortable majority found tiresome and extreme, that Caesar meant to be a king in everything but name. He was often politically clumsy about it. His rigidity sometimes drove moderate men into Caesar's arms. He was not always right about the tactics. But about the fundamental thing, about what Caesar was and where Caesar was going, history would prove Cato almost exactly correct. And when the long political struggle finally collapsed in the year 49 into open civil war, Caesar and his army on one side, the Senate's forces on the other, Cato did not hesitate for an instant about which side he was on. He was on the side of the Republic. He was on the side of the law. He was, as always, on the side of the principle, and the principle was losing. The Civil War went badly for the Republic, and then it went catastrophically. Caesar, the better general by far, won the decisive battle in Greece at a place called Pharsalus in the year 48. The Senate's main army was destroyed. The cause was, in any military sense, finished. The surviving leaders of the Republican side fled, regrouped, and made a final stand in North Africa. Cato was among them. He was given command of the city of Utica, holding it, organizing it, steady to the end. And then, in the year 46, Caesar destroyed the last Republican army at the Battle of Thapsus. There was nothing left. The war was over. The Republic, as a fighting force, had ceased to exist. And now we arrive at the strange, terrible heart of the story. And you must understand it clearly, or the ending makes no sense. Julius Caesar was not, in the ordinary way, a cruel victor. He was famous, genuinely, for the opposite. He practiced what was called clementia, clemency, mercy. His policy, advertised in real, was to pardon his defeated Roman enemies, not to execute them, not to confiscate everything and exile them, to forgive them, restore them, and let them live under his rule as recipients of his generosity. To almost everyone, this was a mercy. To the defeated senators streaming towards Caesar to accept his pardon, it was their lives handed back to them. But Cato looked at Caesar's mercy and saw something that no one else in the wreckage seemed willing to see. He saw that the mercy was a trap, and it was the most dangerous trap of all, because it was a trap made of kindness. Here is what Cato saw. To pardon a man, you must first have the power of life and death over him. Mercy is not an act between equals. It is an act of a master towards someone in his power. The right to forgive is the right of a king. And so for Caesar to graciously pardon the senators of Rome was for Caesar to stand openly in the position of a king, graciously sparing his subjects. Every senator who accepted the pardon was, in the very act of accepting it, acknowledging that Caesar now held the kingly power to grant it. They were buying their lives, and the price, the real price, was their assent to the new order, their signature on the death certificate of the Republic. And this, exactly this, was the Cato transaction one final time, raised to its absolute maximum. Caesar was offering the ultimate second column currency, life itself, survival, the breath in your body, and the price was a piece of the first column so large it was almost the whole of it. The acknowledgement by a free Roman that he was now a subject, that one man's will was now law. Every other senator looked at that trade and took it. Of course they did. It was their lives. Cato looked at the identical trade and refused it. So we come back to the room in Utica on that final night. The ancient sources, especially the historian and biographer Plutarch, who tells the story in unforgettable detail, record the evening with strange, quiet care. Cato was calm. He had already arranged for others to escape by sea. He sent away those who could still get out, organized their flight, made sure of them. He himself would not run. He ate dinner with his friends and companions, and the conversation that night turned to philosophy. It turned specifically to a famous and difficult question, whether the truly good man is the only truly free man, even in chains. Cato argued the case with intensity, and then, the sources say, he retired to his room and read, twice through, a dialogue of Plato called the Phaedo, which is the dialogue about the immortality of the soul, set on the last day of the life of Socrates. Sit with that detail, because it is everything. On the last night of his life, Cato deliberately read twice the account of how another philosopher, Socrates, had faced his own death with composure on a matter of principle rather than escape it dishonorably. He was, quite consciously, preparing, studying the form, holding the dividing line in his mind one final time. And then, when the household was asleep, Cato took up his sword and used it on himself. The first attempt did not kill him. He was found, and a physician bound the wound. And Cato, and this is the detail that has horrified and gripped readers for 2,000 years, when he was alone again, tore the bandage away and reopened the wound with his own hands and finished it. He died in the early morning. Caesar, when he reached Utica and learned of it, is recorded as having said, in something close to grief and frustration, Cato, I grudge you your death, as you grudged me the chance to save your life. And now I have to stop and put the hardest possible question to this, because you should be reeling from it, and an honest channel cannot simply move past it. Is this admirable, or is this a horror? Is this stoic freedom, or is it fanaticism, a rigid man so imprisoned by his own principles that he chose a violent death over the gift of his own life. We do not, on this channel, romanticize a man's death. The act in that room was terrible, and the question is real, and it deserves a real answer, not a noble evasion. So here is the answer, as carefully as I can give it. Cato had spent his entire life teaching one thing, that the one thing a person genuinely owns, the one thing no power on earth can take without the owner's consent, is the integrity of his own will, the first column. Everything else is on loan from fortune. And Caesar's mercy was an offer to give Cato back everything in the second column: his life, his property, his safety, his comfort, decades more of breathing, in exchange for the one first column thing Cato had structured his entire existence around never selling: his consent, his acknowledgement that a free Roman could be reduced to a subject and be grateful for it. To Cato, accepting the pardon would not have been receiving his life. It would have been losing the only thing that in his own lifelong philosophy made the life his. I am not telling you Cato was right to do what he did. I genuinely do not think a person should imitate the act in that room, and I want to say that plainly and without hedging. But I want you to see clearly what the act was, philosophically, because that is why it has never been forgotten. Caesar held total power over Cato. He held the entire second column. Cato's life was by then completely in Caesar's hands. And Cato's terrible final act was the assertion, pushed to its absolute, unbearable, furthest extreme, that there was still one thing Caesar did not hold. The answer to the question, what does Cato consent to? By dying on his own terms, by his own hand, before the pardon could be applied to him, Cato made it so that his life was never, at any point, a gift from Caesar. He died a free man and a citizen of a republic, rather than living 40 more years as the grateful subject of a king. It was, in the most literal and chilling sense, the final move of the dividing line. Caesar could take everything Cato had. He was never permitted to take Cato's no. So how does a person actually use this without a sword, without a Caesar, without a dying republic? Because the literal scene in Utica is not a model, and I have said so. But underneath the terrible scene is a discipline, and the discipline is one of the most useful things in all of Stoic practice. And it is small, and it begins today. The discipline is this: decide in advance, in the calm, what is not for sale. Cato's strength on his worst night was not improvised in the moment. It was the accumulated result of 1,000 smaller refusals made over a lifetime, each one in good weather, before the pressure arrived. He had decided what he was and what he would not trade long before anyone offered him the ultimate trade. And so the practice for you is to do the same thing, deliberately, while nothing is at stake. Sit down and ask, what specifically is in my first column? What are the few things, a particular kind of honesty, a particular loyalty, a particular line I will not cross, that are simply not on the market at any price? Name them. Be precise. A general intention to be a good person will not survive contact with a real temptation. A specific, pre-decided line might. Because here is the mechanism Cato understood. Temptation works by ambush and by smallness. It arrives in the moment when you are tired, when the gain is concrete and the cost is abstract. And it always presents itself as just this once, just a small piece, just a reasonable exception. And in that moment, a man with no pre-drawn line will almost always negotiate. He will find the reasons. The reasons are always available. But a man who decided in advance, in the calm, that this particular thing is simply not for sale, that man is not negotiating in the moment at all. He is not weighing the offer. He is consulting a decision he already made. The line was drawn in good weather by his clearest self, and the tired, pressured, momentary self merely has to obey it. That is what Cato had that the other senators did not. Not more courage in the moment. The moment is a terrible place to find courage. He had a decision already made. He had simply never left the question of his own integrity open to be decided under pressure. And there is one more thing in Cato's example worth taking, and it is gentler than the rest of his story. Notice that Cato, on his last night, also did the practical, caring things. He arranged for his friends to escape. He organized their flight. He used his final hours in part to protect the people he could still protect. His incorruptibility was never a cold, self-regarding purity, a man polishing his own virtue in a mirror. It was turned outward. It was in service of something, the republic, the law, the freedom of other people, the friends he sent safely to sea. And that is the safeguard against the real danger of a story like this. An integrity that exists only to admire itself is just vanity in expensive clothing. An integrity that is for sale is no integrity at all. The thing worth having is the narrow middle path Cato walked, a self that genuinely cannot be bought, held not as a trophy, but in the service of something and someone beyond yourself. You decide what is not for sale, and then you spend the unsold self on the people and the principles it was always meant to protect. It would be dishonest to end without naming the real danger in Cato's example. Because Cato, taken as a straightforward hero, can lead a person somewhere genuinely bad. His story can be misread as a glorification of rigidity for its own sake, as the lesson that compromise is always weakness, that flexibility is always corruption, that the highest virtue is to never, ever bend. And that misreading has real costs. It produces people who are not principled, but merely brittle, who mistake their own stubbornness for integrity, who blow up every workable solution and call the wreckage purity. Cato himself, the honest historians tell us, was sometimes exactly that man. His inflexibility genuinely harmed the republic he loved. That has to be said plainly. So here is the careful distinction, and it is the whole point. Not everything belongs in the first column. Most things do not. Most of the disagreements of an ordinary life, the strategy, the schedule, the budget, the 100 practical questions where reasonable people differ, those belong in the realm of negotiation. And there, flexibility is not weakness. It is wisdom. It is maturity. A person who treats every preference as a sacred principle is not a person of integrity. He is just exhausting and usually wrong. What Cato's example correctly teaches is something much narrower. It is that there exists a first column, small, carefully chosen, genuinely sacred, and that the things inside it really are not for sale at any price, ever. The wisdom is not to refuse all compromise. The wisdom is to know with great precision the difference between the second column matters where you should bend freely and often, and the few first column matters where you must not bend at all. Bend on almost everything. Hold the line on the few things that are actually the line. The whole art is in knowing which is which. That is the teaching. Everything else is commentary. Cato the Younger died in Utica in the spring of the year 46 before the Common Era, and the republic he had given his life to defend did not outlast him by very long. Within 2 years, Caesar himself was dead, assassinated by men who claimed to be acting in Cato's spirit. Within a generation, the republic was gone for good, replaced by the rule of emperors. Cato had lost completely. Everything he fought for was destroyed. And yet his name did something almost no name does. It became a word. For centuries afterward, in Rome and long after Rome, to call a man a Cato was to say one specific thing about him, that he could not be bought. And that is why he belongs on this channel, alongside the figures who chose to live. Marcus Aurelius showed us the discipline of attention. Epictetus showed us the architecture of freedom. Seneca showed us the long preparation for death. Cato shows us something harder and narrower and, taken carefully, indispensable. He shows us the first column held to its absolute limit, the demonstration that there is a self underneath all the bargaining, and that whether that self is for sale is, in the end, the only question that was ever fully ours to answer. He answered it badly, perhaps, in that final room, but he answered it the same way every single day of his life before it. No price, not ever. And you do not need a Caesar or a republic or a sword to use this. You only need to be a person who, in some quiet hour today, while nothing at all is at stake, sits down and asks the question honestly, what specifically is in my first column? What are the few things about me that are simply not for sale? Name them now in the calm, in your clearest mind, so that on the tired, pressured day when someone finally offers you the trade, you are not negotiating with yourself in the dark, but quietly consulting a line that the better part of you drew long ago and meant. Stone and iron. Thank you for sitting with this one. If essays like this are useful to you, the channel is here for them. Subscribe if you want more.